Hello guys, welcome. This is Deepika from mytutorialrack.com and here is the next question for our Java interview preparation. What is the difference between a constructor and a method in Java? So constructor, basically, we have done several examples related to this. Constructor is basically have the same name as the class name. It does not have any return type. Whereas a method can have the same name as the class name or a different name, but also needs to have a return type. If the method is not returning, it still has to provide void as the return type. That is what the method is for. Constructor basically is used to instantiate an object with some default set of values, okay? And if you do not have a constructor defined, you automatically get a default constructor by Java. But if you don't have a method defined, you don't get those methods defined automatically by Java, right? By default, constructor is added to your program, but by default, a method is not added to your program. Okay, so these are some of the differences between a constructor and a method. So let's go ahead and look at some theory here. Constructor is used for initializing the object state. So if you have created an object of the class and that object has some instance variables, if you want to provide a default value for those instance variables, that is when you're going to use constructor. Now, what is method used for? Method is basically to write your business logic or what kind of object's behavior is. That is what method is used for. Constructor has no return type. It cannot have any return type, not even void. It cannot have a return type. Method should always have a return type. Even if it does not return anything, void is the return type that you have to use. So you cannot write a method without providing a return type, whereas a constructor can never have a return type. Constructors get called implicitly. So behind the scene, you're not manually calling an instructor by saying, hey, call the instructor. That happens implicitly, means that happens behind the scene automatically by the JVM. Whereas method, you have to explicitly say that, okay, call this method. Now from here, call to this method. You have to explicitly say that. Behind the scene, it never happens. Whereas constructors get invoked implicitly behind the scene. Nobody needs to know that. It's happening, right? You have not written a statement to call the constructor. It automatically gets called. Whereas methods cannot be called automatically. You have to call them explicitly. If the constructor is not defined, then a default constructor is provided by the Java compiler. So if you have not created your own constructor, in that case, you are going to get a default constructor, which is going to set the values to null or 0 or false or whatever it is. If a method is not defined, then the compiler is not going to provide you any default method. That's just not there in Java. Okay. The constructor name should be equal to the class name. You should always remember a constructor has the same name as the class name, whereas the name of the method can be anything. It can be equals to class name, but I won't recommend you, but it can be anything. It has to have a name. It doesn't have to be exactly same as the class name. Okay, whereas constructor, it is a requirement that it should have the same name as the class name. A constructor cannot be marked as final. You cannot mark the constructor as final because whenever a class is inherited, the constructors are not inherited. So if you use the keyword final with a constructor, you're going to get a compilation error saying modifier final not allowed. So you cannot use the keyword final with a constructor, whereas you can use the keyword final with a method, which basically tells that you cannot override this method in the subclasses. That is the basic difference. So these are some of the differences between a constructor and a method. So always remember, constructor is implicitly called, whereas methods have to be called explicitly. Constructors have the same name as the class name, whereas method can have its own name or a different name, or doesn't have to be the same name as class. Constructors have no return type, whereas methods have to have a return type even if it is void. Okay, so these are some of the common differences between constructors and methods. I hope you are loving these interview series that I've prepared just for you, and I'm going to see you in another video with another question. So stay tuned for that, And thank you very much and have a wonderful rest of the day. Bye bye. Take care.